We were just sitting up here talking about. You'd said something about the Dateline NBC people with the chat rooms, and I'm young enough to grasp the automation, but old enough to not be able to figure it out. Where are these chat rooms, and how do people access them?
That's a great question. Um, the chat rooms are, for the most part, in a Facebook platform, and you can set off individual conversations with either groups or individuals. And so that's usually where the activity takes place for the most part. And so one of the things that you can do is monitor your child's list of folks that they chat with, and you can make them private, so that way they're not public, and that way seeing out somebody from the outside can peer into to that group. Yes, you can create lists and also groups. Groups are open for other folks to come in, but lists are more controllable.
Is there stuff outside of Facebook?
Yeah, they are. I just use Facebook because that's probably the most popular one that people, use, and it's kind of the default standard at this juncture.
Yes, you talked about the time on Facebook, greater than 16 hours or less than 3. Know how to monitor for texting through Verizon. How do you monitor on Facebook, kind of part one? And then secondly, when the addiction kind of comes in, what are the telltale signs that may be going overboard on that?
Those are great questions. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that Facebook per se allows for monitoring of how much time is spent on it. So what I typically talk with families about is limiting the amount of time on the computer overall, and of that, maybe 95% is going to be on Facebook. Maybe 90% is on YouTube. But if you can maintain some idea of how much time on the computer is being spent, then you have a general idea of what's going on. That's one of the reasons that we discourage internet connections, and sometimes with some families I even discourage smartphones in the bedroom, because those allow kids pretty ready access without any kind of oversight. As far as when there might be an addiction or a problem setting in, I would look for signs like being really withdrawn, not enjoying the same kind of activities that one used to, seeming to have kind of depressed mood, or seeming to only really be motivated by engagement in this one activity. So similar to what you would look for in other addictions, but related specifically to something like internet or Facebook, something like that.
While Jalena's getting to the next person, I'm going to give you guys a question that has been submitted online. There's a few questions around the same theme of, I think you've talked a little bit about this, but maybe talking a bit more about particular strategies. People asking about, how do you monitor and how do you keep track of texting and Facebook and gaming and stuff without your child shutting down, without your child feeling like you're stalking them? Some strategies to do that.
Well, there's tools out there that you can use. I tried to capture some of them. We have nannynet.com. You also have McAfee Safe Eyes, and also Web Watcher 7. Those are software packages that you can load up, and you'll be able to virtually monitor the activities that go on with your child's social media activities.
As far as monitoring things like texts and phone use, I think it's a really reasonable thing for parents to monitor that, even solely from a financial standpoint. We've all heard those horror stories about the families who get the $3,000 phone bill at the end of the month because they didn't have an unlimited text package. So I would have a conversation with kids about the fact that I'm going to be looking at the phone bill on a monthly basis because we need to make sure that we're not going way over our plan, for example. Same with the monitoring softwares. I'd have a conversation before installing something like that just to say, we need to make sure that everyone in our family is using the internet appropriately, and so we're just going to have this as something that we do as part of that.
The two packages you just mentioned, those are what you can use. You don't actually have to have an account on Facebook to see what your children are doing. That's one thing. And then how do you get past passwords that kids put on their accounts?
You have to have a Facebook account so they can monitor. That's one of the requirements. As far as passwords, I have to check into that, but I would assume, as was stated earlier, you have to have that upfront contract. It's not a clandestine kind of conversation that you have with your child. It's more of an upfront conversation that you would have with your child. Say, listen, this is what we're having. This is what I'm going to use just to inspect what I expect from you.
And I know some families who've had success with saying, look, either you can be on Facebook and you can friend me, or you can give me your password for Facebook. And just so everyone knows, even if your child is your Facebook friend, they can set up privacy settings now so that you are pretty limited in what you're seeing. So I might lean a little more heavily towards the you can give me your password. What if they don't? That's a really good question. That's a real dilemma, and that is, I think, when you sit down with them and say, look, I'm really uncomfortable about having no idea what's going on Facebook with you.
I've used spies where I've had folks that have friended my in this case my son, and I had that's how sometimes I would get information. So there's different ways to do it. The last piece is you can actually set up an account and put it under not another person's name, but an alias. Technically you're not supposed to do that, but that's the way for you to get past that.
I was wondering if, with this electronic addiction, if you have come across any other studies or data that correlates that addiction to other addiction. Do most of these kids now, because if they're getting on there, becoming lethargic, or not doing their schoolwork, that usually leads to smoking. And a lot of times when they're on texting or Facebooking, they're privately sexting, sending pictures. That's part of why they get addicted, not just checking what's going on. So have you ever come across any correlation?
That's a great question, and I do not know that the research has addressed it yet. And in part because so much of this is new, that a lot of the research is purely descriptive, and they're describing these are the types of kids who use these types of media. I don't know the answer to that, but it is a good question.
Because in my experience, a lot of the private conversations are all about sex because they're adolescents, and that's what they're exploring.
And in that way, not that it's ever comfortable to talk with teenagers about sex, but in that way, this social media adds a new format in which they're having those conversations, but from a standpoint of having direct conversations with kids about sexual activity, risks of sexual activity, things like that, your family's values around those activities, that's the same as it was 20 years ago. There's just a new medium for them to be having those kind of conversations.
So now you catch your kid doing something inappropriate with their cell phone. What do you do? And how long do you take it? They're 15. Do you take it till they're 18? Realistically, what do you do? Because you're still paying on that contract.
For me personally, I've always threatened my kids to the extent that I would take it away from them, and they know that I'm serious about that. If I say I'm gonna do it, I do it, and then once they get a taste of them not having their phone for, say, a day or 2 days or something like that, once the craving is over, it at least sends a message. So again, there's no perfect answer, but that's what I would do.
One of the other things I would say is if this has something to do with another person that your child is sending to some creepy person out there, then you need to call the police. That's the other part of it. And that leads me to my question, because I did encounter a case like that, and it really freaked me out because it really matched, my kids did well in school. I gave them an iTouch for Christmas, and same exact story in someone I saw, and pictures are being sent in that child, and so I think I scared my kids by telling them that story. How do you address that to kids about what you should not do without scaring them? And how do I untraumatize my kids?
You want me to do the parent side? Or?
Sure. Yeah.
I've always been and again, I credit my wife because she gives me the wisdom that I'm speaking to now. But I've always tried to have upfront conversations with my kids as it relates to things that might seem controversial. In doing so, anything that would come up would never be as controversial as it could be if I just put my head in the sand. And so I think I have a healthy enough relationship with both my son and daughter to the extent that I can have pretty much any kind of conversation and feel comfortable letting them know to what degree I'm either satisfied or dissatisfied with, whatever the behaviors that I'm uncomfortable with. Again, I think that's just a personal thing for me personally. It helps to start early because we had that conversation very early, when they became preteens, like the tweens, and we had that conversation really up front. And I had episodes where I had to deal with that, especially with my son. He's raging hormones and stuff like that. I had to deal with that, so I understand that.
And I think from a developmental standpoint, the younger the child is, the more we can think about talking about those threats the way we do talking about just strangers in general. There are people out there who don't love you and care for you the way mom and dad do. And so it's really important that you know who to trust and who not to trust. And as kids get older, you can add a little bit more developmentally appropriate language to that. And probably if we did a show of hands, everyone here can remember an uncomfortable conversation with a parent that they would feel sort of traumatized them at the time. And those conversations sometimes stick in a really positive way. So even though we sometimes worry, I think about, this is going to be so uncomfortable for me and probably really uncomfortable for them, those conversations are important and are part of the ways that we impart to young people some of our values and some of the things that are important for their safety.
I think the good news is you're having a conversation because a lot of people just shy away from it altogether, so you should be applauded for that.
Some questions about the relationship between media use and sleep problems and sort of how to manage that, and are there limits that should be set on digital media prior to bedtime, for how long, that sort of thing?
There is some research out there. It's correlational, so it shows that kids who have more exposure to screen time, especially close to bed, have some difficulty sleeping. We don't know exactly why that is. We don't know if that's because kids who have difficulty falling asleep tend to stay on their iPads or iPods longer because they're having difficulty falling asleep, or if that's in fact what's keeping them from falling asleep. But there is some pretty good reason to think that our brains have a hard time unwinding when we're plugged in or watching TV or having a lot of light and movement and visual stimulation. So I think there's some wisdom to asking kids to shut those things down. About an hour or so before bedtime is what I usually advise, although I'll be honest that is a common sense recommendation. That's not something that has been suggested by research that like 60 minutes is the optimal amount of time.
As a parent, I can relate to that. My son would play the Xbox games, and he did his homework, and the contract was that if you do your homework, you can play. And so by him fulfilling his end of the requirements, we allowed him to play, but we did shut it down like at around 11 o'clock or 10:30 or so, and just say, hey, it's time to shut it down, because he would still be somewhat wired, because he would play these war games and stuff, which obviously gets you already wired. So I can relate to that.
I was going to make a comment about the previous question when we were talking about having those awkward conversations with our children. And I have two children. I have a daughter that is almost 19, and she's at college now, and then I have a son who's 11. And I probably waited a little late to talk to my daughter about sex and all that, but I think she was 13. But how I did it, I didn't feel real comfortable with having the quote talk, and I wrote a letter and wrote everything. I could write it out real easily and make sure I didn't miss anything about the cons of it, and she thanked me for that. She, I think she was glad I did that, and I just wanted to share that.
I bet. Thank you.
Hi, I am an administrator at a middle school, so my question is more from a professional standpoint, but what I see a lot is parents who realize they've let their kids go too far on the social media, that You know, they let them kind of with your question, you know, they're on the Facebook and they have lost control of it and they don't know what to do. So I guess what can you say about parents that need to pull their kids back and regain control? What's the best way to do that?
Well, I will share with you a resource that is called The Parent's Guide to Facebook. And so if you Google it, it gives you everything that you really need to know. I've read it from front to back, and it's very comprehensive. It gives you all the information that I think you would need to know to have that conversation, even on the technical side, to ensure that certain things are put in place to make sure that your wishes are taken into consideration as it relates to what you want, from them. So if it's a PDF file, I would highly recommend this.
And it's also, I think, really helpful to make sure that if you're doing something like scaling back, kids have something to replace that activity with. Behavior change for all of us is a lot easier if we're not just given a stop doing that, but also a do this instead. So I would recommend that, for those families to really pile on a lot of extracurriculars or pile on a lot of other things that can replace that time is probably going to be helpful in winning that battle.